Welcome back to the Francisca Show. Today with us, we have Professor Chaim Saiman. Welcome to the show. It's so great to have you.
Thank you.
The reason for our conversation today, and I'm so excited about it, is because quite surprisingly, I've asked several people to talk about this topic, and then you showed up in my life, and then we decided this was a perfect opportunity to have you on to talk about Halachik innovation. I don't know what other better way to present this topic other than as history proceeds, there is room for Halakhah to adapt. Rabbis don't like to talk about that so openly, and you have studied this area a lot, so I'm so excited to have you on to talk about this.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm a professor of law at Villanova University, Charles Widger School of Law. They gave a lot of money for that, so you got to add that in. This year, I'm at the Herbert Katz Center at University of Pennsylvania for Advanced Judaic Studies. I also function in a bunch of sort of informal capacities in the community. I give shiurim. I wrote a book that was published a couple of years ago called Halakhah, the Rabbinic Idea of Law. And I've generally been interested in most recent periods in sort of halakhah and culture, halakhah and society, and the way all those things work together. I also serve as a dayyan on the Beth Din of America.
That is very comprehensive. And do you have rabbis part of your education?
No, I was in yeshiva a bunch of years, but I'm a smicha dropout. So I am not a rabbi. And so I don't answer shilas. I'm more of a commentator than a rav, which sometimes I wonder, should I just go do smicha? I certainly have learned and continue learning all the time. But it sort of has happened that I sort of enjoy the fact, or I've learned to kind of enjoy the fact that I'm not a rav, and therefore I don't speak in authoritative terms. No one's going to rely on me for psak, which I think gives me a little bit more freedom to think around the edges in that role.
I remember somebody once telling me, aren't you bitter you can't be a rabbi, or, whatever female version of rabbi that exists today in some communities. And my honest response was, as a non-rabbi, as somebody in the media, I actually get to say whatever I want, as opposed to a rabbi who cannot say what they want necessarily because they'll be quoted or misquoted or misinterpreted, and they have to watch what they say, especially if they serve as a posek or dayyan. So
right. So I will say, and you can edit this out, right? Given that I am on the Beit Din, I do have to be a little bit careful. So we'll see what comes up.
Okay. So with that introduction, I would like to start by talking about retail versus wholesale halakhah. And could you explain that concept to us?
Sure. Let's back out a little bit and think about the conversation today about halachic change, particularly within Orthodoxy, which is basically what we're talking about. I think every discussion on halachic change that happens, certainly in the United States, or I think to some degree in Israel, in the Orthodox world, happens against the background of the experience of, we'll call it Reform and Conservative Judaism. These movements, in different ways, starting in the 19th century, began to change not just sort of individual practices, but sort of like whole mechanisms and whole understandings of halakhah. The Orthodox understanding about this is that initially it was that this was problematic in Kfira. And I would say 100, 150 years later, I think many in the Orthodox world sort of look at the results and say, you see, we were right. It didn't last. Conservative Judaism had its high watermark in America in the decades following the Second World War, 50s, 60s, 70s, had a strong generation or two, but today is in a lot of trouble. And that's certainly the way the Orthodox world looks at the heterodox communities, and therefore largely feels vindicated in being somewhat obstinate about halachic change. And I would say particularly halachic change at the wholesale level. So for example, no more mechitza. Women rabbis, a lot of things having to do with women in shul spaces. It's sort of egalitarianism sort of throughout, and a whole bunch of other things that were done. And I think that sort of frames what I would call the reflex, right? The sort of wake someone up in the middle of the night. What do you think? First word? Yeah, can't do that. On the other hand, there is and has always been halachic change. But the way I think of this, and this is terms that developed in conversation with my good friend Ellie Fisher, another really smart analyst and commentator, more of a historian than I am, is that one way to think about it is that we're much more comfortable changing things at the local level. We can think of it as like the back door rather than the front door. I think these metaphors all get to the same place. So let me give it one example. It's a sort of older example, but I think sort of sets up the template. Al Pi Din Torah, and in the Gemara, a daughter does not inherit if they're sons, right? The parsha of the Noslavchad in the Torah talks about daughters inheriting, but that's, of course, when there are no sons. But when there are sons, the sons inherit. Now, one way to do this is to say, look, and this has been tried in a bunch of periods in history, in the Middle Ages, much more recently in and around the development of the state of Israel. Look, this isn't fair. This isn't egalitarian. We're just going to make a rule from now on, sons and daughters inherit equally, or something like that. I'd call that a wholesale change. A retail change has been what's happened, which is they started developing an issue that's called a shtar chatzi zachar, which we'll leave out the mechanics, but basically is a document that stipulates a large loan to the daughter, a sort of astronomical amount, that the daughter is then willing to sort of trade for a proportional share of the inheritance. In the beginning, chatzi, half of what her brother would get. Let's leave out the bechor for a minute. This is complicated things. That then developed into what today is often called a shtar zachar shalem. In other words, that half portion has bumped up to a full portion. So fundamentally, many, no, not all, many from Jews using this mechanism through, forget about secular law and wills, just through straight up halachic means, are giving their daughters an equal share to their sons in the inheritance. But it's done that way, sort of around the back or retail, in such a way that we say, okay, the structure of the din d'oraita, the din Torah of the inheritance law stands. In practice, there are ways, particularly if you are skilled and know what you're doing and looking for, to accomplish other ends. Some people like to say we're going to leave a nominal, but not ridiculously nominal amount to be divided up in Torah. So let's say $1,000 or maybe $5,000. So the largest say $10,000, that will be left and divided per din Torah, meaning the Bechor gets 2 shares and the rest of the brothers get a share. But the bulk of the estate inheritance will be divided more equitably. So that to me is a traditional example of what we might call a retail or a backdoor way to think about halachic change, that you keep the structure and you change the practice.
What are some other examples?
Now, look, these can also run the gamut between things that are institutionalized and things that are not, and things that are more well-known and things that are less well-known. The Beth Din of America's prenup is a certain way to blunt the effects of the halachic divorce laws, right, which give all the power to the man. And I think it's another example of this. The conservative movement basically changed the ksuva to functionally, we won't get into the details, equalize divorce laws. And the Orthodox community rejected this. It had, of course, halachic reasons, but one could say that's too wholesale of a change. But if you go on the side and do this, enter into this document that sort of enforces a din Torah, a halachic obligation for a man to be responsible for his wife's sustenance, and then says, well, if the wife leaves the marital house, he's no longer doing that, so now he has to pay that. And then it uses American law to make that enforceable in the Beit Din, so it's a sort of joint effort between a halachic idea and an American law idea. And then in practice, it comes pretty close to at least blunting some of the worst parts of the worst abuses of the sort of classic system of get refusal. But again, I think contrasting that solution to the sort of just declaration that either halachic divorce law should be fully egalitarian, or to put it into the ksuva, so then sort of touches the structure, that seems to be another sort of example of where this happens. I think you could also think of retail as not sort of only using devices, but to specific people. That we say, okay, this thing is usually asur, but if you go and ask, sometimes you get a heter. And then we could sort of ask what sometimes.
Like abortion.
So abortion is a great example. Your sister-in-law, I think, wrote about this very, very effectively a few years ago. And that case is actually very interesting, I think, because the public stance is often very, we'll call it abortion skeptical. And that leads sort of a way in which these things are, I'll call it advertised to the public or presented to the internal public. Leave aside what we tell the other world, and that became a big issue a couple months ago. But then, as Avital, I think, showed, it is, look, we don't know the numbers, or there's no stats here, but it is not unusual that in a certain type of case, with a certain number of factors, woman, couple, whatever it is, goes to the Rav. And of course, they're choosing which Rav to go to. And these things become more possible. I don't want to get into sock and whatnot, but we see there that's another sort of wholesale retail example, slightly different than we talked about before. And I think there, if I'm to sort of figure out think about what's happening there, I think that there's a value in having there's certainly a reticence in halachic culture to what we call usually derisively abortion on demand, or the sort of most radical or most extreme pro-choice versions. On the other hand, it doesn't line up with the pro-life halacha position, more or less. Of course, that's debated. So this sort of a little bit lets you grab the cord with two ends. Is that at the kind of cultural expressive level, we go one way, but we say, listen, life's complicated. Sometimes there's needs, sometimes there are competing factors. And depending on the posek and how they understand the halacha, that may come to bear. Yeah, you could think of this as also in sort of like less fraught areas. There are all sorts of solutions that we give to, let's say, someone's about tshuva and they have to go home, and eat with their parents and live with their parents around Shabbos and Yantif and Avelos and Kashrus. And so there's all sorts of socks that people will get that sort of allow that to happen on a kind of local and needed basis. So I think that this is one way to think about halachic change, is that we certainly in Orthodoxy is hesitant of sort of broad policy statements that, well, because A, B, C, and D happened, therefore, X is going to change, but rather sort of let things happen locally, much more bottom up through practice.
Let's go through some more examples. I just want to acknowledge, on one hand, halacha is very rigid and inflexible, and then on the other side of halacha, there's this nuance and custom psak. Your factors matter to the psak, and your mental health matters, and all these different dynamics that make halacha nuanced and multidimensional. So I do want to bring up topics like women learning Torah, whereas when Sarah Schneer was bringing up the Beis Yaakov system for girls, that was so controversial. Now you're not frum enough if you don't go to Beis Yaakov. Let's step on that for a minute.
When I try to think about this, to take the way you phrase it, halacha is very inflexible. So I want to drill a little bit to think about what's that a product of. So let's imagine we're going in a time machine, 150 years ago. Nobody thought 150 years ago that the rules about, let's say, women in the shul space, to kind of throw a bunch of different issues together, were particularly inflexible or formal, because they merely mirrored what else was going on in society everywhere. So part of what happens as social change happens and happens quickly is that all of a sudden a gap is exposed that wasn't there before. So if we were to go back and ask our great-great-grandmothers if they thought that the rules about limiting women in the shul space were particularly formal or rigid, they'd probably looked at you funny. Now, they might have said, the whole world's like that. What are you picking on shul for? Or they might have just sort of assumed that's the way the world works. But either way, they wouldn't have seen us halacha being rigid as the issue here. Now, what's happened is we've had radical change in the what I call women in the public sphere over the last 100 and something years. And halacha or halachic practice I don't think it's remained stable exactly, but it's certainly not gone with the sort of fully egalitarian norms that the broader society has. And then right there, that gap is what we experience as rigid and formal. But this isn't answering, but I just want to express what's going on. You could think the same thing with the Aguna crisis, what we today call the Aguna crisis, which maybe more accurately is the Mesuravot get. 100 years ago, there was a different sort of Aguna problem, basically people running away from Europe to America and leaving their wives and families behind. But what we now call the Aguna crisis didn't exist because The secular laws were more similar, they weren't exactly the same, but were more similar structurally to the halachic laws. What happens in the 60s and 70s, you start getting what lawyers call unilateral no-fault divorce, which basically is a fancy way of saying either half of the couple can leave the marriage at any time for any reason or no reason. Just say, I don't want to be here anymore. That becomes absorbed in first in society and then in law. And then all of a sudden, this sort of gap between that and halacha emerges. And that's what we today call the Aguna crisis. But if you think, as I do believe in the Haredi world is thought, that a woman should not be allowed to leave the marriage unilaterally, unless there's fault, meaning unless he can prove the husband is not fulfilling his halachic marital obligations. So then you don't see the present case as an aguna crisis. You simply say, yes, the halacha is doing what it should. It's accurately reflecting the norms. So again, I just think this is a general way to just conceptualize all these questions, that what they are gaps between a social norm, often a changing social norm, and a halachic regime that does change, but certainly changes more slowly and doesn't change wholly. And that gap is what we're experiencing here, as to use the words you use, as inflexible.
Let's talk about examples like shaving for men. And I know some sects don't shave at all. You have that in the Hasidic area. So let me tell you where I'm coming from. I've heard this said by a woman. Men figured out how to shave. They found the halachic loopholes. Why can't we find the halachic loopholes to get women more either opportunities or more flexibility around women's mitzvos? For example, head covering or other tznius related halachos.
Since we're talking about hair, my first reaction is a sheitel is a loophole. If a sheitel allows a woman, I understand they're uncomfortable, but basically allows a woman to appear in public in a way that, unless you kind of know what you're looking for, doesn't seem all that different. And even if you know what you're looking for, is often seen as satisfactory. So I would just pause there for a second and to say, I think the thrust of what you're saying, there's something there, but we do live in a world where sheitels are part of certainly from American Ashkenazi culture. You probably know better than I that they can be very fancy and very well done. So that is a form of a loophole. But I think the answer to the question a little bit touches on what I said before. I think loopholes can be found when there's an underlying agreement that they should be found. Or let's rephrase it. It's easier to find loopholes when you substantively think that the practice should change. Part of what you're picking up on is the fact that people don't think these practices should change. And therefore, the loopholes seem to be hard to find. So in other words, what I try to do is redirect the question from the loophole to what is the social basis that sits on. So everything having to do with gender, particularly in the Haredi world, and then to some degree in the modern Orthodox world, is contested space. One could say that the Haredi world in its entirety is sort of fighting a battle, maybe not on every single front, but on many fronts, with the way modern culture conceptualizes gender and gender relationships. And therefore, that is reflected through the halachic practice. Some of it by keeping things, and some of it, as you've previous shows talked about, adding new things. So that's the way I would think about it, more than where can you find the loopholes, is sort of think into society and the social structures. Where are they demanded? Where are they seen as necessary? And where are they not? Now, that question is harder to map out, but I think that is the core question. Let me give a very different example. Again, somewhat less contested space, but I wrote an article about this because to me, this Dafka looking at an uncontested space might give us a little bit, or it's contested, but in a different way, it's a different set of issues. So after 1967, when Yerushalayim was captured, and there was immediately a lot of question about Shiva Asar B'Tamuz, Tisha B'Av, and particularly Natim, the prayer we say, Ashkenazim say it's in Mincha Tisha B'Av, which describes Yerushalayim as sort of a desolate, barren city with no one there. And shortly after 67, there were discussions like, look, Yerushalayim is under our control. How could we say this? there were a few people who advocated what I would call wholesale front door change to that. Some chuvos written, discussions in sort of the frum press, and largely they didn't go anywhere, right? Largely, there's a sort of deep halachic conservatism that says we don't do that. To go further, even the fast, leaving aside Tisha B'Av, but let's say Shivas or B'Tammuz. So this is subject of a discussion in the Sugi and Gemara Rosh Hashanah, based on how it reads, a discussion in the Sefer Zechariah in Tanakh. But there's a decent argument that in the present social political circumstances, a reading the Gemara says, you don't need a fast, the minor fast, everything but Tisha B'Av and, of course, Yom Kippur. But there again, I think the innate halachic conservatism says, that feels too front doory. That feels like you're rupturing something very deep in the tradition. On the other hand, as I wrote in this article, a lot of the second order practices of Tisha B'Av have changed a lot, and I would say in my lifetime. Traditionally, Tisha B'Av is a day where you don't learn Torah. And I think at some point that meant literally you don't learn Torah. And then the Gemara and the Poskim discuss very particular parts of certain Sfarim in Tanakh and maybe a little bit of the Gemara that you can learn. But even there, you're supposed to learn it quickly. So, not that you have any insights to that, because Torah is enjoyable. Torah is life. Torah is, at least we try to make it the biggest joy in life. And now, across the denominational spectrum, you will see that Tisha B'Av is devoted to day-long, and because we now use videos and whatnot, you don't even have to be physically present, very deep shiurim, or kinos, that with a deep explanatory basis, that are sophisticated and well thought out and thematic, and people will spend till 3, 4 in the afternoon listening to this, basically learning Torah. More, if you go to the Kotel on Tisha B'Av, you will see tens of thousands of people there. Now, invariably, when tens of thousands of people get together, it's a social scene, even if they are conscious that it shouldn't be. In the poskim, they say, listen, maybe you should go to visit graves. That's cemeteries is a common Tisha B'Av pastime. But they say, but if it's going to be a scene, don't go. And here you go to the Koso, and there's, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people easy. And you're going to run into everyone from camp and yeshiva and seminary and whatever. And then, more recently, a practice developed of this Tisha B'Av kumsitz, particularly at the last hours of Tisha B'Av, but you can see it also at night, where people, so NCSY sort of runs it, I guess you'd say, or is a germ of it in the Kotel, and they attract thousands of people, and in Hebrew it's called Shirei Neshama, or slow Shirah. It's very moving, very uplifting. It's hard to imagine you go back 200 years to Tisha B'Av in Vilna, and that they would be singing soulfully. And now it's even broadcast, right? So that here you're in America, you're still it's still the middle of the afternoon, sometime before Chatzos, and then you're watching these people sort of a very uplifting Tisha B'Av moment. Even the name, I'd say it's very interesting. The Kotel, if you look in English, 50, 60 years ago, was called the Wailing Wall, right? Which I traced down. There's an article that explains it comes from Arabic, but that's where the Jews used to go wail. And today we call it, in English, you call it either the Kotel, or if you use English, you call it the Western Wall. Little characters change. So to me, all these things, and there's some other examples we could go through with Tisha B'Av, but you see that on the one hand, the fast is there. The 5 main inurim are there, right? We don't wash, we don't brush our teeth, we don't drink, we don't, and I think changing that's going to be very difficult, and it seems unlikely until some great messianic era. But just underneath that, the sort of character of the day has changed, and the sort of social, cultural dimension of what Tisha B'Av means. It's very different. In Israel, they even do Siyura Cholot, right? They'll walk around the walls of Yerushalayim. One year I saw pictures of that, and then I put it next to pictures of Yom Yerushalayim. And I said, hard to tell which one's Tisha B'Av and which one's Yom Yerushalayim. This is a way of saying the culture is changing Tisha B'Av at the kind of on the ground level without really touching the most rigid or entrenched halachic norms. And I think that is the way these things happen pretty common.
There's another big topic that sort of started up this conversation for us I would say, the Kolisha space.
Hmm.
Tell me with your words, actually, what you picked up on.
So I'm speaking someone who knows this much more, but through following your social media and whatnot, I saw that there's this way to kind of wriggle in between the lines where, traditionally in frum society, I don't need to tell you this, women didn't perform. Now, of course, in theory, women could always perform for women. And I assume that happened here or there in sort of small-ish spaces and venues, but it was never very public. And then I saw that now, you put a Kol Isha sort of, gets to adopt a trigger warning on a song or on a video or whatnot.
I like to call
What?
it a consumer label.
A consumer label, right? But picking up on a different discourse, right? A trigger warning. And you put it out there and you say, listen, I'm keeping halacha. If somebody wants to go and see this, that's on them, not on me. So some of that is technology enabled, right? But some of that is saying, listen, we're going to find this space, right? And then it wasn't just you, as you explained to me, it was a whole bunch of women who, you could do a spectrum everywhere from like just performing from co-ed audiences to only performing sort of in your living room to your mother and sister and maybe your cousins. And then like, a million points in between of where you could be to sort of wedge into this. And that is changing, or at least bringing this other thing to bear. And then here I know less, but I think in Israel, right, and these things often surround the army, where you'll have from people sometimes involuntarily at Tikkasim, at ceremonies where women may sing or perform, and everything's fractured. But there's certainly a part of the frum world that's like, okay, you know, maybe not what we would do, but, don't walk out and protest because that's worse. So you see a way in which sort of no one's going to say there's no such thing as Kolisha. Now then this connects to other Heterim that have been around for 100 years. It's different voices, two voices. If it's not live, it's recorded. Right? So you sort of put all these things together and then there becomes more of a space. There's of course a reaction to that as better than I. And one way to read the, fairly recent event that happened in City Field, I don't think so much about Kolisha, but about sort of women, from women in online spaces more generally, which I think in part is a reaction to the fact that this crack opened. So you're gonna have this push and pull.
And for anyone interested, we did the 200th episode focused and dedicated to covering the Asifa that took place in Newark. Let's talk about front end versus back end changes. And that's different from wholesale and retail. This is where people just start acting differently on the grounds. And then the rabbis just, or leadership or lack of, just accept it or close their eyes to it.
So one thing that happens, and it's a little related to the conversation we just had, but one thing you want to ask is sort of like, what happens first? Does the halachic analysis happen first? Or does practice happen first? And then it can become minhag. And one of the things that happens is that certainly in the commercial sphere, in the business sphere, there's even a principle that minhag can override halakhah in some situations. The Yerushalmi has a very evocative phrase called minhag mivatel halakhah. The Bavli doesn't have that, but it says hakol ke minhag hamedina. Now there's questions about the parameters of that. But certainly in sort of business issues, this is probably the easiest space, is that once a community or a community of traders or business community practices in a certain way, even if that's not what the formal halacha is, that can happen notwithstanding its sort of asymmetries with the formal halacha. So that's sort of least controversial in the Choshen Mishpat in the business space and very much a part of how contemporary Bate Din work. But that also has implications, and I would say in other fields. One example I often think about, I think if we were starting from scratch and you say, can a frum person go to medical school and be a doctor in the US? And let's go back 60, 70 years before there's any such thing as a Shomer Shabbos residency or anything like that, right? You are invariably going to break Shabbos. And you're invariably going to break Shabbos to save non-Jewish lives so that your pikuach nefesh heter is covering non-Jews. As a matter of formal halakhah, all those things are problematic. And yet, I think probably starting in the 20s and 30s, medicine became a well-known avenue for the frum community. Such that by the time this becomes that the rabbinic establishment is strong enough to come and think about it, it's already just a fact of frum life. And very, very important, maybe even less today, because there's other professional avenues and non-professional, meaning non-professional school avenues open to frum people. But it just became just part of the structure of frum life in America and the Galut generally. And then the interpretation of various Hilchos Shabbos worked around that. You could think of owning businesses on Shabbat, which are complicated. You can throw Pesach in there too. But these things happen. And then sort of like, how do we square them halachically? And you want to contrast that with things that need rabbinic approbation at the front end. So anything that happens in the shul space, whether it's gender related or just liturgy related, the way shuls work is you're going to ask the rabbi first. I think things with marriage and divorce, the rabbinic input happens first. And because of that, I think that there's a different structure to these things, that it's easier to, if practice develops, and not practice, I think here is important to understand, not practice of people we wouldn't call frum, but practice of people we recognize as our peers, as people of our community, maybe in our aspirational peers, people who we look up to religiously. If that community is doing something, particularly in Ashkenaz, right, that has long been almost like a halachic position. And Ashkenazi halacha has a long history of thinking this way. And that has a weight. But if the nature of the question, and again, I'm thinking of things that happen in the shul sphere, where the rabbinic input happens first, so then it has a different structure. And I think you generally will see more conservative halacha, so to speak, because it's not going to rely on me. There too, it's funny, we're recording this the day after Yom Kippur. And I always say there's been a change to the machzer in the last 30 years. That actually relates to something we talked about before. If you look in any machzer printed, I believe the Koren is the only one that has it printed. But if you look in the art scroll and it's certainly anything before that, after they blow the shofar, it says L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. And the same thing with Haggadahs. And then at some point, clearly after 67,
they added Habnuya.
People started adding Habnuya. They probably just did it because they felt, And now you'll see that the Koren machzer and certain Haggadahs will print Habnuya. So that is a liturgic thing that comes from the bottom up. But you see that you kind of get a sense from how this happens. So these are not absolute, but these are ways that practices become entrenched in community. And I think this is the important part, entrenched in communities we halachically respect. Solomon Schechter, 100-something years ago, had this idea of what he called Catholic Israel. Catholic Israel, he meant not Catholic the religion, but sort of, like the universal people. And the frum world rejected this. But I think it's important to think about why. I don't think his idea was wrong conceptually. It's just, it's not one person, one vote, sort of the way he talked, right? If you're not otherwise living the life that we recognize as a Torah life, then your vote on any particular thing in Hilchos Shabbos or Kashrus or whatever doesn't count. The minhag is strong, dafka, when this group of people, this community is otherwise living a life that the people around it respect and look up to. And then it could become a minhag, or at least their minhag. I always like to think about who's not bikaris and who has an unusual shita. That word in frum halachic discourse, when we say it's a shita, it means it's a valid opinion. I may not agree with it. I may think it's a little off the walls, but they're entitled to have it. As opposed to, oh, that's crazy. They're from that bikaris and they're not frum. So I think sociologically, I always think about who gets to be a shita and who is off the wall and not frum. So from a kind of Litvish Ashkenazi perspective, certain things with Zmanin in the Hasidic world, particularly Chabad, like seem off the wall. Who say, that's their shita. Now think, why do we react and think, that's a thing I don't love it, but they're entitled to do it. That's their thing. As opposed to someone driving on Shabbos. Okay, so you can argue there's halachic differences, but even on the minhag phrase, I think part of it is we say, does this community live a life that we recognize as authentic to how we understand Torah? And what they've said is generally yes, they're allowed. Everyone's allowed a couple of weirdos, right? A couple of shitas. When it's not, so then it becomes very, very fraught. To go back to the feminism point, or the women's issues point, I think part of the reason this is such a contested space is because all these innovations tend to invariably happen in the communities that everyone else is least sure about whether they're in or going to stay in. And therefore, imagine, again, this doesn't happen, but imagine that they found out that deep in some Hasidic community, women did something that we found somewhat unusual. I think this would not cause, I think that would get tagged as a shita. Right? It does not cause this rupture because, listen, we're in no concern that they're going anywhere. But Dafka, because these innovations tend to come from like the liberal edge of modern Orthodoxy, and in earlier generations, conservative and Reform Jews, and because of the history that we talked about, I think that they're the most contested and sensitive. So I always ask, it's always worth asking, who gets to have an unusual shita and who's outside because they're doing something that is not accepted.
And to add, in my experience, all the yotzot halacha that I've met, everyone who doesn't consider themselves a rabbi or that they're giving psak, they happen to be the most sincere, observant, very machmer type of people on their own Judaism. People love to put it under a blank statement as women who want to speak or want the attention and this and that. They're half reform or conservative. And then when you meet them, they just love learning and they have a dedication to halacha and being very, look at how they dress, look at how they conduct themselves. But their commitment to halacha is very sincere.
Yes. And so I think that is by design. The Yoatzot understand the space that they're in. They understand the communal constraints, right? They understand that it's very important not to be a Maharat and to land on this space. And I think they're very consciously doing all these things. In fact, I think it's not a secret that in selection for Yoatzot, right? When a woman applies to the Yoatzot program, that sort of thing that you're talking about, sort of the affect, the space in the community, the space personally, is something that is considered. And I think their success in finding that Gesher Tsar Ma'od within the modern Orthodox community is in large part a function of having a deep intuition of where these lines are and what they look like. For now, things can change. These things can change. One suspects, again, here I'm kind of talking at the edge of my skates, but that if the first waves of this were very America-driven, the future waves of this are going to be very Israel-driven. You have in Israel many institutions of various types that are where women are undertaking very serious Torah education. I think there's just more of them and a greater variety in Israel. And I don't know where that's going to lead, but something's going to happen. There's going to be some way in which there's a public expression of this. And there already is. Just to take one example, we're just coming off Slicha season. So it's known that Slichas and Migdal Oz, the Yeshivat Har-Etzion Gush's women's division, is an event. By the way, it's an event that has no parallel for men. In other words, Slichas at Gush are like, okay. But Slichas at Migdal Oz are this event where thousands of women are coming, and by the way, men go to see the event. Is that halacha in the narrow sense about paskening? No, but it's clearly related to this. Something is happening. I don't know where it goes. And people are thinking about this and grappling all the time. Again, I always say that these conversations only make sense against the background of Reform and conservative Judaism. The reflexes, and I think that they're ultimately healthy reflexes. One could argue on points here and there, right? But like, it's almost like saying, look, this was tried to do it all and all at once. And look what happened. And I think the frum world, and I would say legitimately, lives in that shadow. You could argue point by point and issue by issue, but I do think that certainly in America, the experience is like, look, we tried. It's almost like they're saying, hey, we tried. Look what happened.
And people will say that about modern Orthodox Jews as well.
Correct. And I think this is not unrelated to modern Orthodox slide to the right, which, is a complicated story. But, there's counterexamples as well. But I think part of the slide to the right is a sense of like, you get too close to that line and we know where it ends. Now, could someone come and show, no, here's how it works? Maybe. And if they do, and it works on a mass scale, I think that will change the discussion. So I've said this before, Ethan Tucker, a good friend of mine, is the head of Machon Hadar. Machon Hadar, if your audience doesn't know, is an interesting sort of experiment of an egalitarian space but that really models itself on yeshiva, say yeshiva type culture. In other words, unlike the JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which modeled itself on a Protestant seminary, which modeled itself on a university, Mechon Hadar's, I think, main insight in this American Jewish scene is saying, no. What yeshiva gets right is the structure. You start with Shacharis, you have Seder, you have Shir, you sort of live together, you have Shabbos together, right? It's a full experience. And they draw on a lot of, I would say, yeshiva particularly kind of has their and modern Orthodox yeshiva culture, except it's fully egalitarian. Now, I always said there's going to be a very easy test to know if this works or not. And the test is as follows. Will there be...
Where are their kids from?
No, not even that. Will there be egalitarian airport minions? What do I mean? If you're, from male, female too, and you're somewhere in the airport traveling and the sun's about to go down, it's mincha, right? So all of a sudden you see a bunch of other people, maybe the flight's from Israel, maybe not. Mincha, and then in the corner of some, I'm talking about non-Israel, in the corner of some gate, there's an impromptu mincha minion that takes about 6.5 minutes. What is that showing? That's showing that people have embodied the need of tefillah b'tzibur so much that no matter where they are, they're going to find it. And there are other people who are immediately identifiable as, are you part of our group or not? We mentioned Ellie Fisher. We've talked about this with him. The seventh inning stretch at minions at baseball games, right? You're there for like the most guyish experience imaginable, an American baseball game. And you don't really want to miss the game. So you find that, okay, well, like, stupa minchen. Now, you could look at this very cynically, right? But you could also look at this like, no, this is what it means to have a chiyuv, right? To understand yourself as obligated on this. So if Machon Hadar or any such non-Orthodox, more egalitarian community is able to produce people who just, and I don't mean 5 people, I mean enough people, right, to matter socially, that will just like wherever they are, there's enough and you can just have an impromptu mincha minyan. Let it be egalitarian, 5 million, 5 million, whatever it is. At a baseball game, right? Then that will have succeeded. And I've told this to Ethan and he has adopted this. So I mean, he agrees that that's the test. So now you can have a deeper question of is that possible and what makes that possible? But what I'd say is if that happens, I think this conversation in the long run changes.
I think key factor you mentioned is identifiable. If people aren't identifiable, then...
That's right. I have to know whether I can ask you for mincha. We're not Chabad. We don't go around saying, are you Jewish, are you Jewish, are you Jewish, right? Part of the way this works is that within 0.2 seconds, I can figure out whether you're up for mincha or not.
Tell us about your book.
So my book, Halakhah, the Rabbinic Idea of Law, is an attempt to try to understand the Halachik system from a kind of legal law professor lens, looking at how is it that at the same time the study of Torah and therefore Halakhah is a religious devotional activity that is done without any reference to whether it's Lamaisa, whether it's a law, whether we practice this. It's sort of devoid from that. And we ascribe religious meaning to these very technical legal discussions. At the same time, it's also the basis of a world of practice and a world of the way things live. Now, I would say these two things pull in different directions. What makes something a great social text is its openness, its multiplicity, its ability for many, many different groups to identify with it. And Halakhah has to serve that function. What makes something a legal text is pretty much the exact opposite. It closes options and it directs people towards a certain program and way of behaving. And to me, the most fascinating thing about Halakhah is it's doing both of these things in the same genre. So what, as let's say Americans, we think of art or music or movies or various culture products that are sort of touchstones that everyone should be able to access in their own way. At the same time, we think that's really, really different than law, which is about narrowing. So to me, the core tension is Halakhah as an expanding discourse and Halakhah as a narrowing discourse. But we use the same text for both of these. And the book, in many different ways, works out what that means for law, what that means for religion. Another way to say it is, what happens when your religion is effectively law, and what happens to your law when it's effectively religious.
I highly recommend reading this, and we're going to link it in the show notes. Okay, this has been such a lovely and informative conversation with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And where can people find you?
So I teach at Villanova, I'm not a huge kind of social media person. I'm on Facebook sometimes with generally light content. Every now and again, I write in the Lair House or in the Jewish Review book, social commentary tradition sometimes as well.